Waco.
John Talty, CBS Sports, with us on 365 Sports. He's been with us on the show a nice chunk of times, and we appreciate him being on with us again today. John, trends, sports, whether it's football or basketball, people like to steal what works elsewhere or like the trends, defense, schemes, offense, whatever. The general manager, when it began, did you ever expect it to be as important or as, I guess, big as it is right now?
It's a great question. I think when it first started, and the one that really comes to mind for me early on was Austin Thomas, who has had that position now at a number of different places. It felt like really more of a glorified title, more of a name than anything, than the actual power to do the position the way that we know that it is at professional level. But, since when Austin, I think really got that title to where we are now, a lot has changed that made it much more necessary, I think, for programs to have general managers. Of course, a lot of that contract negotiation, first NIL, now revenue sharing, just the management of a roster has changed a lot, I think, in the last 5 or so years. So you've seen a lot more get involved and feel a need to want a general manager. And like you said, it's a copycat league. So once it starts, popularizing, you see more and more do it. And I think just in the last 18 months or so, we've seen it become a lot more important and a lot more programs investing serious money behind it, with the top end of this position over the 1 million a year mark.
John, do you think that they will start more and more? Like, I think about Oklahoma and bringing in Jim Nagy, for that job. Will this start to work more like an NFL general manager job and not just and maybe take some of the traditional recruiting roles away from on the field coaches?
I think it's TBD in some ways. And I mean that because, and I got into that in my story, recently, it's that we're seeing so many different approaches right now. And I think Jim Nagy at Oklahoma is a great example of, it's a different operation. It's also, which I think is interesting, we've seen this at a couple places, not necessarily tied to the head coach. And I think, that doesn't work out with Brett Venables. Venables can lose his job and Jim could keep his. At other places, the GM is much more tied to the head coach, is even, in fact, maybe reporting directly to the head coach in a way that Jim is not at Oklahoma. I think how those different structures work could determine, like we said earlier, the copycat nature of it, which path people want to go down. We're seeing right now a variety of different things, whether it's a Jim Nagy approach. You've got guys who are much more recruiting focused. One of them I wrote about the other day, Vince Marrow, who was a top recruiter at Kentucky for more than a decade. He becomes Louisville's GM. That's more of this guy can recruit. He also can eval, but it's more based on that. Whereas Jim, more the eval side of things, personnel. Other guys are more kind of salary cap gurus. So it's kind of a pick your poison right now. And we'll see 3 to 5 years from now which one is the most successful. I think you talk to some of the college GMs like I have, and some of them are skeptical of the NFL impact. We've seen a lot of them hired in the last 12 months. And, I think there's some skepticism as to whether it's gotten as close to the NFL model as some of them think, and also just whether they're going to want to deal with all the unique aspects of college football that make it a good bit different still than what it's like at the NFL level.
So many of these guys have different backgrounds. We know the story, and of course, we know James Blanchard. He was a website contributor. Crazy that he's become where he is now, and he's worked hard to get there, and he's hustled too. But the one from Michigan, Sean Magee, this just like, wow, I'm probably the only MBA who is sitting in this role. I'm probably the only quantitative economics major that's sitting in this role. I went to the Naval Academy. I'm probably the only one of those. And he also was a surface warfare officer. I mean, what a wonderful resume and incredible background for a guy where he is now.
Yeah, and he was also, this is more traditional, but also chief of staff for the Chicago Bears, and Michigan convinced him to come back. And I know Oklahoma was also interested in hiring Sean before they ended up hiring Jim Nagy. So he has pretty interesting background, and you've seen the impact that he has. And he played point man on them getting Bryce Underwood, and something that Michigan had been a bit more cautious in the NIL era. They of course won national championship, but then Jim Harbaugh leaves and they have a new coach, and they kind of get off to an early stumble against Texas, and I think it helped them realize that we need to be more aggressive, and he played a big role in kind of organizing the group, famously getting Larry Ellison and his wife involved to kick in some money for Bryce Underwood, the number one recruit in the country. But that just shows all the different paths you can take. But yeah, I think when I was reading about Sean and talking to people who know Sean, his background definitely jumped out to me as one of the more unique ones in the country. But it's also, I think it's cool because I can think I'm a pretty big baseball fan. We've seen those guys kind of pop up at the MLB level, whether it's some of the Moneyball guys that Billy Dean was able to scoop up, but everywhere from Yankees, Red Sox, Cubs, they're finding people with unique backgrounds, analytical backgrounds to try to help them find an edge. And I think Sean really fits that that nature at the college level.
John, the other thing that the teams are doing is bringing in famous people to be their GM, like Shaq is the GM at Sac State for basketball. Andrew Luck was essentially the de facto athletic director, at least. He had that role in charge of the football program. Ron Rivera at Cal. What are those roles different than maybe a guy like Jim Nagy or Austin Thomas?
Yeah, I think I certainly have a question as to what the Shaq, the Maxx Crosby, what those guys are actually doing. I think they're essentially volunteer roles. So I don't know if it's like maybe they help fundraise from time to time. Maybe they just wanted to add one more title to all the other things that they do. It's been kind of interesting to see those ones prop up. Maybe there's tax benefit that I'm not aware of, but those guys are really not involved in the daily level and not that hands-on level that the Austin Thomas and Jim Nagy and those have. But it is interesting that some of these guys have wanted to get involved, and you hit on. I think there's a couple of the bigger names. Andrew Luck, Ron Rivera, guy at UNC, Mike Lombardi, who's former NFL GM, been in the media game for a long time, and all those guys have real power. I think people are curious to what level of success that they have. I think Rivera and Luck in particular are in tricky situations at Stanford and Cal, especially, weird fit in the ACC. Both those programs have seen better days, and it's going to be hard for them in some ways to compete with this current world. But, they're in it. And both of those guys have booster level support, which has empowered them with, a good bit of leeway to do what they want. So we'll see at Stanford what that means long term, who they hire after the 1 year Frank Reich experiment ends, and at Cal, whether Ron Rivera wants to keep Justin Wilcox or maybe go a different direction if they don't improve upon last year's disappointing season.
What made Austin Thomas so successful?